Dr. Antonia Mantonakis is a fellow of the Cool Climate Enology and Viticulture Institute, an associate professor of marketing at the Goodman School of Business, and associate faculty of psychology at Brock University in Niagara, Ontario, Canada. She's a psychologist by training and holds a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from the University of Toronto, and has both a master's in experimental cognitive psychology and a doctorate in experimental cognitive psychology from Simon Fraser University. Her research focuses on the psychological factors that affect consumer behavior and consumer decision-making when it comes especially to wine. Welcome, Antonia.
Thank you.
All right, great to have you here. Now, you've done a couple of very interesting studies, so we're going to talk about both of them. The first one I wanted to ask you about is you've come up with some findings that indicate the ease with which a winery name is pronounced does have an effect on both our perception of the wine and the price. Maybe you could tell me a little bit about that.
Okay, we ran a really simple experiment on our participants for that study. We had participants come here into our lab at our Cool Climate Institute at Brock University here, and we randomly assigned participants to taste wine that was labeled either in a with a difficult to pronounce winery name like Talepu Winery, or an easy to pronounce winery name like Tatakis Winery. And we also had a third group of participants who sampled the exact same wine but was not given any winery related information. And we wanted to see if this associated winery name had an impact on their perceived taste of the wine, how they evaluated the overall quality of the wine, as well as how much they were willing to pay for the wine in Canadian dollars. Now, I should point out that the wine we used in the study was student-produced wine here at the university. We just manipulated the labels so that we could really get a sense of, keeping the same wine, but just changing the label or having no label to, have a really controlled experiment.
Right.
To see.
Okay. And what did you find in terms of the more difficult to pronounce? Those are Greek-related names that you've chosen, a simple one and a more difficult one. Is that right?
Yes, we did extensive pre-testing on which exact names to use in our experiment because we wanted to control all other variables that could potentially impact the participants' evaluation of the wine. So you'll notice that in these two wines, the easy one and the difficult that I mentioned, they both start with the letter T. They're both 3 syllables long, and they're both Greek-sounding names. Now, we pre-tested that wine name pair as well as a whole host of other name pairs that we could have used in the experiment to make sure that in the pre-test with a different group of participants, they were matched in terms of pre-experimental familiarity, that they were equally likely to, for people to say, yeah, I think I've heard of that before. We didn't want one to be more familiar than the other. We also asked participants about the perceived prototypicality as a winery name, because again, we didn't want one to seem more prototypical for a winery name than the other. So we matched all of those variables. And so when we did the tasting study, we just wanted to make sure that if we found any differences in perceptions for the easy versus difficult to pronounce names versus the control condition, that they were due to the perceived ease or the perceived fluency of pronunciation. So that's what we did. And our results actually indicated that not only did participants evaluate the taste of the wine as being higher quality in terms of the overall evaluation when it was more difficult sounding, but our participants also reported a higher willingness to pay for the wine.
Wow. And was the margin wide, or I guess I should say statistically significant between the difficult and the easy to pronounce? I'm assuming that for the difficult one, they were willing to pay more. They thought it was a better wine.
Yes, that's correct. We compared the ratings for both the difficult to pronounce winery name wine as well as the easy to pronounce winery name wine to the control condition, and we found there was no statistically significant difference when you compare the easy versus the control, but there was in fact a difference when you compare the perceptions and the ratings for the difficult to pronounce wine name and the control. And yeah, they were statistically significant. And what was also more interesting that we were a little bit surprised by is that this difference was pronounced even for participants who had higher knowledge about wine. So we gave participants at the end of the study a brief questionnaire that asked some kind of like wine trivia questions, color of different grape varietal names, for instance. And many participants who are more casual consumers tend to get some of these questions incorrect, whereas more enthusiastic, higher involvement wine consumers tend to get the majority of these questions correct. And so based on that questionnaire, we were able to look at the data in a different way and see, well, is this finding, does this occur for more casual consumers, or does it occur for the more knowledgeable, more interested wine enthusiasts? And we actually found that it was even the case, and in fact it was more pronounced, the data were more robust for the more knowledgeable consumers, which was kind of surprising. Yeah.
Yeah, you'd think that they have this knowledge, but they're more influenced by a difficult name. Wow. And I don't know if you had enough participants, but were there any differences between, say, men and women, or older, younger, or anything like that?
We did look into any other potential demographic variables that we collected, and we didn't find any other differences. And the only thing that we did find, as I mentioned, was with the enthusiast versus the more casual consumer. And the way we explain that is that when a consumer is more enthusiastic and maybe more passionate about wine, is they're really paying attention to the label and maybe the vintage and these other characteristics that they try to use as cues to evaluate the quality. So if they're more likely to use all of the different cues or indicators that they have available to them, then they might just happen to be more influenced by them, and so maybe that is the explanation for why we found this.
And that makes more sense. Not that they would be more gullible, being knowledgeable, but that they're just paying more attention to the details. How much more were they willing to pay for the difficult name?
About $2 on average, which is it seems like a small number in an absolute sense, but if you think about the sale of wine, or think about this from a pricing standpoint and from a marketing standpoint, that could translate into a big difference in a large scale. So it's pretty significant.
Absolutely, and the categories are pretty tight in the liquor stores. We think about, or at least the industry, I believe, thinks about premium as being, say, 12 to 15, and then there's a huge jump once you get over $15, and another big drop off in terms of what percentage of the population is buying wine that's, say, over $20. It's a real cliff fall, I think.
That's right. I agree with you, and so that's why these findings are very important.
Okay. And what would you recommend then? Would you take these findings and tell a winery, hey, you should have a difficult name? Or are there other factors, like if you have a difficult to pronounce wine, people are going to be intimidated in terms of asking for it in the liquor store or on a restaurant wine list? I mean, what's the takeaway for the industry with this?
Well, you raise a couple of really good points here, and one is should we get concerned if our name isn't difficult to pronounce? And I should say that this is just one variable, and this is just one factor, and we haven't looked at the relative influence of the sound of the name versus the price versus the familiarity and all of these other variables that do have that we already know about have an impact on consumer decision making. What the takeaway is that here's something new that the industry and consumers should know about and be aware of, and use that if they can in their own research or in their own development, because it's something that we haven't really considered before. And so that's the takeaway here for industry. Now, the second point that you raised, which is a really interesting one about maybe do these findings apply if a consumer is verbally asking for the name of a wine in a restaurant or maybe at the LCBO. And the other point is that, well, we did this study in a controlled laboratory context. We did it here, and we really tried to isolate the variables and have it in a controlled context. And while that's really good experimentally, that we can confidently say that we've isolated all those variables, well, in the real world, when a consumer is verbally asking or ordering a wine at a restaurant, well, that's a different context. And so what we really need to do is try to replicate these findings, in a winery or in the LCBO or in a restaurant to see if these results hold in those contexts. And we don't have the answer to that. So I just want to caution people to take these findings with a grain of salt because they are laboratory based for now.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. But it's setting a great foundation because I think the value of all science and research is to pose more questions, to understand at least one factor deeply, and then to go from there because you've laid a foundation here that I think is pretty significant. I'm just thinking about what other variables you might test. I'm sure you've considered lots, like different name pairs in different languages, like two French-sounding names, or the impact of, say, even the Greek names that you chose on a red versus a white wine, or if you're saying Merlot versus Shiraz, if that's paired in with it. What other kinds of factors might you test in the future?
Well, I'm happy that you raised the grape varietal sound as a potential variable because that's the most recent study that we've been exploring and we've been testing in the lab is how does the ease of pronunciation of a grape varietal name affect a consumer's evaluation of the taste of the wine and how much they'd be willing to pay for that. And we think of the Niagara region, for instance, how we produce great Rieslings and great Gewürztraminers, and people go into the winery and say, "Can I try the G wine?" Because they can, and then they're told, "Well, just call it the G wine." And well, maybe if they're encouraged to say Gewürztraminer, is that better or worse? What will that do for the consumer? And so we just pre-tested a bunch of grape varietal names that again matched on first what the first letter was, how many syllables, and we started running a tasting version of the experiment very similar to the one I just described with the winery names. And what's interesting is what we're finding so far in our results, and these are just preliminary for now, but we've found that consumers actually like the easier to pronounce grape varietal name better than the more difficult to pronounce. And my only explanation for that comes from previous research in psychology on ease of pronunciation for ingredient names, for food additive names and things like that. And consumers tend to try to avoid any kind of food additive or ingredient names that sound too unfamiliar or where the letter combinations in the English language are very infrequent, like having an X in there and followed by another consonant or preceded by another consonant, those kinds of odd letter combinations, which is how consumers tend to evaluate if something is easy or difficult to say. And so yes, our preliminary findings are for grape varietal names are in line with, well, if the wine is made with this, so it's an ingredient or it's a something that's an intrinsic component of the wine, and it's not familiar, it sounds difficult to say or maybe rare, then consumers maybe tend to want to avoid it. And again, it's one study in the lab, so it's something that we definitely want to look into further to further explain it.
Absolutely, that's fascinating. I wouldn't have guessed that. I would have just made the same assumption that the brand name and the ingredient name, so to speak, the grape, would have similar findings, but that they're different is even more interesting. So we have, Antonia, a wine here today. We tried to find one that was really difficult. We've got the PF, that odd combination. Pfeffenheim. Am I saying that correctly?
I think so. I think your guess is as good as mine, but I have mine here with me too.
This is an Alsatian Pinot Gris. I guess we could have done one better and chosen the Gewürztraminer, but we've got a Pfeffenheim Pinot Gris, which came out recently in the LCBO, and it's a nice crisp white. But would this be a typical example of something consumers would definitely find difficult to pronounce, to ask for?
Yes, and what makes it difficult to pronounce is this odd letter combination, and odd for the English language, this PF combination occurring at the beginning in the first syllable of the word is something that we don't encounter very often in the English language for English-speaking consumers. And the Pfeffenheim, again, that's not typical in English word, and so that entire combination makes this what would probably come out in our pre-tests as being rated as a more difficult to pronounce name that's not very similar to English, at least for English-speaking consumers.
Absolutely,
Yes.
yeah. That the cultural context is important. So it's perfect and difficult. I want to see if it's complex, if it tastes as difficult as it is to pronounce. Oh dear, this is just the fun part.
Oh yes.
Can't have a wine discussion without getting thirsty.
That's right.
I wonder if there's, anything, because I'm sure importers especially have to face this in their more Anglophone markets, of how to take a very traditional winery name or label from Alsace, from Germany, from countries that have a really different phonetic syllabus, sense of language, and how they introduce a wine like this. Any tips for them?
Sorry, I'm just having.
No, yes, go ahead.
I'm having problems opening my bottle. It's like difficult to
open, not only to pronounce.
It's only difficult to pronounce.
Well, it's consistent.
So
Consistent.
just give me a second here.
Mm-hmm. Ah, well, got lemon purity here that I think would overcome the difficulties. Yeah, the cork can be a little bit dry on these. So we've got the nice, fresh, lots of clarity. But yeah, would you have any tips for wineries, especially from other countries that are importing wines with difficult names? I mean, I guess the perception's on their side that this might be a more expensive wine, but I would think that it's a challenge, though, getting people to be familiar and comfortable with it.
Well, and that's another really important point you raise, is that we ran this study using Greek names with English-speaking Canadian population, and most of our participants were from the Niagara region, so people from the community, employees at the university here at Brock University, and students as well. And the names that we use were difficult to pronounce for those consumers. And so we have to keep in mind what the expectations are of the consumers, of what's easy versus what's difficult to pronounce, and their also their expectations of maybe the country of origin and those other variables that we didn't examine. And I'm a big fan of experiments and doing pre-tests, and so even just doing some research into what people's perceptions are and whether they think something is easy versus difficult to pronounce, whether it's the winery name or the grape varietal name or the combination of both, to see what impact that has on consumers' preferences, could just be so meaningful for a winery or for an imported wine name or whoever might be interested in knowing the answer, because it's going to be this different for what the name is and who the consumers are for.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
So what do you think of this wine? if you've had a chance to. There you go.
I think
Good.
it is very amazing, actually.
Yeah, I'm liking it too.
I really like it.
It's easy to like.
It's very easy to like. It's semi-sweet, and yeah, I like it. Yeah.
Well, it's got some nice acidity. It'd be great for food. Maybe difficult to pronounce dishes or something. I don't know,
Yes.
from Alsace.
Yes. That would be another study that we could run. is to look at-
Science has no end.
That's right.
That's great.
Yes, that's right.
Antonia, thanks for joining me today for this chat. We're going to come back really soon, like in about 5 minutes, and talk about the other study that you did, which is equally compelling, I think, about celebrity wines. So thanks again, and we'll chat soon.
Thanks, Natalie.